Look, I've spent 20 years wearing a badge in a county where you'd think you'd seen every shade of human ego, from the small-town speeder to the career criminal. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepares you for the sheer, unadulterated entitlement of a suburban homeowners association president with a chip on her shoulder and too much time on her hands. They say absolute power corrupts absolutely. But in the cul-de-sacs of Willow Creek, apparently, a little bit of power just turns people into aspiring dictators. And I found that out the hard way when my neighbor, a woman named Beverly Vance, decided that her clip-on earrings and laminated clipboard gave her the right to stage a full-blown military coup on my front porch. You see, most people in our neighborhood just wanted to mow their lawns and be left alone, but Beverly lived for the gotcha moments patrolling the streets in her beige SUV like she was looking for insurgents, and her latest target just happened to be my vintage 1978 Ford F-150. It's a beauty, a project truck I've been restoring with my son, and it was sitting perfectly legally in my own driveway. Clean, registered, and tucked away, but Beverly decided it was an eyesore that violated some obscure, non-existent aesthetic ordinance she probably dreamt up over her morning kale smoothie. She started small, leaving these passive-aggressive neon yellow sticky notes on my windshield, telling me that, industrial machinery, wasn't oppos, permitted in residential sight lines, which was hilarious considering it's a pickup truck, not a bulldozer. But I ignored her because, as the chief of police for this county, I have actual crimes to solve. I think my silence just fueled her fire, though, because the notes turned into formal letters, and the letters turned into fines, hundreds of dollars in fines, that she claimed were backed by the full weight of the HOA's legal authority. Now, I know the law, I live the law, and I knew for a fact that State Vehicle Code 22507 clearly prohibits private associations from overriding municipal parking regulations on private property. So I just filed her notices in the shredder and went about my day. I didn't oppose. T thinks she was crazy enough to double down, but Beverly wasn't oppos. T used to being ignored, and she definitely wasn't oppos. T used to losing, especially not to a guy like me who she probably thought was just some quiet, blue-collar worker who didn't oppos. T knows rights. The real trouble started on a Tuesday, my day off, when I was sitting in my living room with a cup of coffee, and I heard this aggressive, rhythmic pounding on my front door. Not a knock, but police style, thumping that made my instincts kick in immediately. I checked my security feed and saw Beverly standing there, looking smugger than a cat in a creamery, flanked by two guys I'd never seen before. Big guys, wearing matching navy blue polo shirts and tactical khakis, with these ridiculous oversized badges hanging from their necks that looked like they were printed at a 24-hour Kinko and Oppos. Yes. When I opened the door, Beverly didn't oppose. To even say hello, she just gestured to the two goons and said, Chief Miller, since you've chosen to ignore our citations, I brought in our Compliance Enforcement Division to handle the situation. One of the guys, a guy with a buzz cut and a neck thicker than his brain, stepped forward, put his hand on his belt like he was reaching for a weapon he didn't oppose. T have and told me, Sir, you are in violation of HOA Code 402. And if you don an oppose, T move that vehicle and sign these admission papers right now. We have the authority to place you under citizen's arrest for noncompliance. I almost choked on my coffee right then and there, looking at this guy who was barely holding back a smirk, realizing they were actually serious. They were trying to, police a chief of police with a fake badge and a made-up code. I've seen some bold moves in my career, but telling a sworn officer of the law that you oppose, we're going to arrest them for parking in their own driveway, is a special kind of stupid. Yet I decided to play along, keeping my voice low and confused while my hidden body camera, which I'd slipped into my pocket the moment I saw them on the monitor, recorded every single syllable of their felony-level impersonation. I asked them what law gave them the power to arrest a private citizen, and the second guy, the skinny one who looked like he'd watched too many reruns of Cops, actually told me that, under the emergency powers of the HOA Charter, we operate with the same authority as the county sheriff, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing, because that statement alone was enough to send them to prison for a long, long time, but I just nodded, thanked them for the warning, and quote, and watched them strut back to their car like they'd just taken down a cartel boss. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd finally scared the, unruly, neighbor into submission. But what Beverly didn't and oppose, T realized, was that she'd just handed me a silver platter of criminal evidence. I spent the next few hours pulling the footage, verifying the identities of these two, officers, who turned out to be nothing more than out-of-work security guard from a failing mall, and checking the HOA and oppos, its recent bank records, which I have the legal standing to investigate given the complaints. It turns out Beverly had been skimming, find money, to pay these guys under the table as her personal muscle, a little private army to enforce her will in the neighborhood. And I was the one person who wasn't into oppos. T gonna let it slide. I knew they'd be back, though, because bullies like Beverly can't stand a lack of immediate gratification. And sure enough, the very next afternoon, a white SUV with, HOA compliance, stenciled on the side in cheap vinyl letters rolled onto my lawn. Not the street, but my actual grass. Out stepped the, dynamic duo, again, but this time they wearing into oppos. T just carrying clipboards. They had heavy-duty plastic zip ties tucked into their belts and a pair of handcuffs that looked suspiciously like the ones you buy at a Halloween store. Beverly was right behind them, filming on her phone, screaming about how, justice was coming for the lawless, and at that point, the comedy was over and the professional in me took over. The big guy approached me on my porch, his face red, shouting that I was being, detained for obstruction, and he actually reached out to grab my arm, which is the exact moment his life changed for the worse. You see, you don an oppos. T spent 20 years in tactical training just to let a mall cop manhandle you on your own property. So as soon as his hand touched my sleeve, I moved. It was pure muscle memory, a fluid pivot, and a wrist lock that sent him spiraling toward the pavement before he could even register that I was an oppos. T just summoned, stubborn old man, He hit the ground hard, his knee catching the edge of the concrete step with a sound like a dry branch snapping, and he started howling like a wounded animal, clutching his leg while his partner froze in absolute shock. The skinny guy tried to lunge forward, probably thinking he could save face, but I just stepped into his space, used his own momentum against him, and sent him face first into the dirt, where he stayed, gasping for air and crying about his nose. Beverly was hysterical now, screaming that I was, assaulting officers, but I just reached into my back pocket, pulled out my actual gold-plated county chief's badge, and held it 6 inches from her face until she finally went silent. These aren't an oppos. T officers, Beverly, I said, my voice as cold as a morgue slab, These are felons, and you're their accomplice, The look on her face, the way her jaw just dropped and her skin went a sickly shade of gray, is something I'll cherish until the day I die, especially when 3 real squad cars, lights dancing and sirens wailing, tore around the corner and boxed in her SUV. My boys didn't an oppos. T go easy on them, either. They saw their chief being threatened on his own property, and those 2 fake, compliance officers, were in real steel cuffs and in the back of a cage before they could even finish their first sob story. We took Beverly in, too, right there in front of the whole neighborhood, who were all coming out onto their porches to watch the, Queen of Willow Creek, read her rights while her phone, which was still recording, captured the whole pathetic downfall. At the station, the 2 goons folded faster than a cheap card table, admitting that Beverly had promised them a, bonus, if they could get me to sign over the truck in oppos, as title as, payment, for my outstanding fines, which moved the charges from simple impersonation into the realm of racketeering and extortion. It turns out this wasn't oppos. T just about a truck. Beverly had a long-standing grudge against me, because I denied her nephew a job at the department a year prior due to a failed psych eval, and she thought she could use the HOA to ruin my life, as some kind of twisted payback. Instead, she ruined her own. She lost her house to pay for the legal fees. She's facing 5 to 10 years in state prison, and the HOA board was so terrified of being sued into oblivion that they dissolved the entire association a month later. Now, I sit on my porch every evening, the 78 in oppos, Ford parked right where it's always been, and the neighborhood is quieter, kinder, and free of, compliance officers, with plastic badges. But it makes me wonder, how many of the people out there are being bullied by these tiny, self-appointed kings and queens because they don an Oppos? Do you have a badge to protect them? Is it ever okay for a private organization to act like a government? Or have we just let these, neighborhood associations, become a breeding ground for people who crave power they never earned? I'd love to hear your stories. Have you ever had an HOA cross the line into the illegal? Or am I just the lucky one who had the tools to fight back? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I went too far, or if Beverly got exactly what she deserved. And if you enjoyed this little slice of suburban justice, Don and Oppos, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because believe me, the world is full of people like Beverly, and I got plenty more stories about what happens when they finally meet the real law.